with as we go. So also feel free, maybe use the chat function to put questions in the chat, also for the discussion later on during this little workshop. I, of course, need to acknowledge the partners that helped me doing this research and getting to where we are now. We partnered with people from, what is going on? We partnered with people from Macquarie University that helped us with some remote analysis of canopy cover and also our tree selection tool. And then, as I said, funding mostly came from what is now DPI, and at the time was the Office of Environment and Heritage. We also had co-funding of the project for an industry relationship fund that we have within Western Sydney University. So there was additional funding injected into the project to actually make it a little bit bigger than what we had intended at the beginning. Today, it is a very streamlined talk about the background of the project briefly, then show you one slide about the study design so you get an idea of what was involved, and then introduce some results. And I guess most important is number 4 when we get to recommendations. What can actually be done to mitigate heat across school outdoor environments? It's probably very important to note right at the beginning, this is about outdoor environments, not about classrooms. We have programs that look at classroom environments, look at CO2 concentrations, look at air conditioning and learning outcomes, but this is nothing that we will cover today. So for the background, this is a graph that I use a lot in recent presentations just to bring it home that we are facing hotter summers and generally increasing temperatures throughout New South Wales. Often in my type of research, I hear from particularly older people that, oh, when I was young, you know, we didn't have air conditioning, we were fine at school, we just basically hunkered down and sat it out and we were fine, look where I am today. Well, yes, there maybe have been days above 40 degrees, maybe 1, maybe 2 if we are unlucky in your summer in the 50s and 60s. But as this graph shows, we have increasingly warmer temperatures. We are looking at the temperature anomalies based on data that was averaged across 30 years between 1961 and 1990. And just within the last 15 years, we had 12 of the warmest that we actually ever recorded in this state. So it's a very clear trend, basically agreeing with everything that we're seeing around the world. I also undertook some more specific investigations around summer heat, because the argument can of course be made that, you know, when it's really hot, the kids are on school holidays. They're not at school, so why should we even bother? The point was taken, and so I sat down and looked specifically at call them the shoulders of summer. When we look at the times in November, December, and in February, when the kids are actually still at or have returned to school, and we still have summer conditions. So in those graphs, A, B, and C, you'll see decadal temperatures. In the top, there's the number of days above 35 degrees Celsius. In the middle, you see the number of days above 40 degrees Celsius. And we also have at the bottom the mean maximum air temperature for those decades that are then calculated for, as you can see at the bottom left of the slide, for these periods which I describe as the shoulders of the summer or peak summer times, if you want to call it that. Now we see 2 different trends, one for a holiday time in gray and one for school time in black. I don't want to go into more details in this graph. The most important thing is just look at the dotted lines. All of them point upwards. It's a positive relationship where we see increasing over the last 4 decades or 5 decades that I listed here in this graph, we see increasing number of days above 35, we see increasing numbers above 40, and also our mean maximum temperatures are going up while we are not only in holidays, but also while we are at school. So increasing heat, and in this instance, in extreme heat, is becoming an increasing issue at schools. The data speaks a very clear language here. Now, how does the government respond? I guess you're all familiar with the Cooler Classrooms program and also the spending that we are currently seeing being rolled out across the state. We have increasing numbers of school-aged children in the next decade that we need to deal with. This is basically a consequence of the increase in population growth more broadly. We are requiring an additional 164,000 new school spaces by 2031. So that's just about a decade away. The government in 2018 released a program, this is the state government, released a program of about $6 billion that was geared to either upgrade existing or build new school environment. And within that program, we also have a $500 million program called Cooler Classrooms that looks at equipping existing classrooms and new classrooms with air conditioning. Interestingly, a lot of schools that are hot, because once you experience a heat wave, for example, it doesn't matter if you have otherwise a lower mean summer maximum temperature than qualified by the program, you still experience that heat wave and it will still be very hot in your school. However, for this Cool Schools or Cooler Classrooms program, you need to be having an average January maximum air temperature of more than 30 degrees. Then you automatically qualify to actually participate in that program. Now, lots of schools do not fall into these high temperatures. And as I said, they still experience very high temperature stresses during heat waves. So it's an interesting discussion that I have with some schools that are trying to then monitor their own microclimate to figure out how hot is it really in this school, because they may just fall under this 30-degree bar and will not get air conditioning anytime soon. Looking at what it does when you have or when you don't have air conditioning in your school, we have a very clear picture now from more and more studies emerging around the world, looking at learning outcomes that are influenced by your classroom temperature. So what we see is for an 1 degree Celsius increase in average school year classroom temperature, a 2% reduction in learning outcomes. So this is a number that now is basically confirmed by several types of research. There was one extremely large, included more than 1.4 million school kids, large study from the US, where this 2% outcome was basically confirmed. We see in this little graph here an annual average temperature in Fahrenheit, please. So it's not 80 degrees Celsius in those classrooms, it's Fahrenheit. And the PISA standardized math score here clearly shows that with increasing classroom temperature, you score lower in your math outcomes. There are, of course, underlying factors in graphs like this, because you could say the hotter countries are also poorer countries. But we see the same trend happening across first world countries, not just because of dividing first, second, and third world countries. So there's a clear relationship between the classroom temperature and the learning outcomes. And now, of course, the question is, when we have the students learning in these environments that are not optimal for learning, do we then basically provide them with not the same opportunities as with someone that is learning in air-conditioned space? And if we look at the school as a whole, what other options do we have to also reduce air temperature and heat outside the classroom, which of course will have an effect due to reduced radiant heat and also lower air temperature on the classroom environment itself. Also, once you have a cooler outdoor environment, you probably have more incentives during summer to have outdoor teaching and learning activities being implemented, and also have less heat stress related to your school break or lunch break and recess activities that would then basically produce kids that come back from these times being spent outdoors where they are less hot, and therefore they can concentrate on learning in the classroom much more quickly. Now, within school outdoor environments, it's very interesting when we look at what kind of knowledge we have and also what the regulations are for those outdoor environments. We know that outdoor learning activities are highly beneficial and stimulate the cognitive abilities of our school kids. For children, and this is a study coming out of out of Europe. So a study out of Europe found that the recess time in school can be about representative for about 25% of the children's daily physical activities. And also when we, as I mentioned before, have those well-designed, maybe even air-conditioned classrooms, we still have lots of schools that, of course, would go through heat waves, and therefore we see impacts on the school children, but of course also on managing staff, teachers, and so on, who are all impacted by these extreme heat events that we see, particularly in the Sydney Basin. Already, and this is not just me talking, already we have research pointing towards the benefits of cool school outdoor environments, but they are sometimes very difficult to implement because of the high proportion of hard surfaces. This comes down to maintenance, and maintenance often means no trees and unshaded bitumen, because that's just the lowest maintenance that you can get. I promised just one slide about study design, so I'll keep this very brief. This is an aerial impression of that school. You can see a range of symbols. We looked at air temperature, surface temperature. We also looked at tree water use and analyzed a lot of these conditions in the full sun, but also in the shade. We went on and also measured what is called black globe temperature, which is basically something that translates to a feels-like temperature, because it's a composite of air temperature, radiant heat, wind speed, relative humidity, and so on, representing something that you would feel being in such an environment. Because, of course, 30 degrees in Darwin can feel very different to 30 degrees in Melbourne, just because, for example, of relative humidity. We went on and did a whole tree canopy inventory and looked at canopy cover as well across the school. And as I said, we measured tree water use. All this was done because we see in trees the equivalent of a relatively low-cost air conditioning system that can help you reduce temperatures around the school, not just surface temperatures, but also air temperature. But to provide these benefits at an optimal stage, you want to have them hydrated well. You probably can't see, no, it's not really visible in this slide. There are 3 water tanks that are installed in this school, but they were not hooked up for any irrigation of the vegetation across the schoolyard, which was one of the things that we pointed out that could actually help. Once you have this water stored in summer, you can provide irrigation to your vegetation to provide greater cooling benefits. Just within that picture, the red symbols are all the positions where we measured air temperature. The little white and gray triangles indicate where we looked at surface temperatures in the sun and in the shade. The little yellow square in about the center left is a reference weather station that we installed at the teacher's car park. And the little blue diamond-shaped symbols represent the 10 trees that we measured water use of. Now let's have a look at some results. This is the same kind of impression with an overlay of canopy cover. So we calculated the entire schoolyard size or area, and then looked at the proportions of cover of the site. And you can see it's 27% buildings, 32% hard surfaces, and 41% open space. You can see there's a central schoolyard that has basically no shade at all. Towards the south, there is an outdoor play area that is having a lot of trees, but at the time when we were there, this was the summer of 2019-20, extremely dry, and most of the ground vegetation had basically died back, and we looked at bare soil most of the time. Tree canopy was composed of 69 individual trees. 93% of those were in good or very good health, according to our assessment, providing about 20% shade across the site, or the equivalent of 3,680 square meters. So we really looked into how much shade is provided, also where is this shade provided. For example, this is the image in orientation to north, and you can see that the whole line of buildings at the northern edge of the school is only shaded by a few trees on the northern boundary that would take out the sunshine during midday and early afternoons, which really helps cooling this area down. But a lot of these trees have even recently been felled because the school wanted to establish a nice international garden with fruit trees, which of course are low stature and will not provide over the next years any shade to those buildings. So there are some strategic assessments that we've done, but most importantly was probably the analysis of air temperature and surface temperature across the site. And let's have a look at some of those results. This is a map that we then created from the air temperature measurements that we collected. This is for the entire measurement period. We started at the 17th of December and ended just before the start of February when the school kids came back. It was, I have to say, it was also really helpful to have my equipment across the school when the kids weren't there, because of course they're curious and inquisitory, where I could lose them because of vandalism or because of theft. And as we did all of this work during the school holidays, my equipment was safe and I got some really high quality data back that didn't have any holes because instruments went walkabout. Now, this map is interesting because it is not based on modeling outputs. It's actual data. It's empirical measurements over these 6 weeks. Every 10 minutes, we have near surface air temperature measurements. And we averaged for each of the 20 positions where we measured air temperature, we averaged those measurements looking at about, oh, I can't remember, it's about 500,000 data points. That then helped us create these maps where we interpolate the individual averages against the surrounding averages, giving us a continuous surface that you see here represented as colors that represent certain temperatures. And the interesting bit, of course, is for the management of the school, they now have a map that clearly outlines where the cool zones of this school are and where hot environments are, helping you to inform management of school times during certain activities. One of the activities that I already mentioned was the either morning recess or the lunch break. And these maps now look at specific time intervals that we extracted from our general data set. And then again, looked at air temperatures and how they actually pan out across the whole school. Once you start to know your school environment and where it is hot, you can of course start to implement controls or advice to your teachers and those educators that are outside during
recess or lunch breaks, looking after the kids and inform them of limiting activities in those hot zones or encouraging or / encouraging activities in the cool zones. Because of course that means that the risk for overheating or heat exhaustion is much lower for those kids. It also means that if funding would be available, then of course you now have identified areas where interventions against heat would be most efficient, whereas you also know areas where you really don't need to do much about bringing temperatures down because you're already looking at cooler areas. Interestingly, when you look at the morning recess map, all the cool zones during the morning are actually related to those zones where you have tree cover, particularly to the southern end or southwestern end of the main schoolyard. There was a very large eucalypt tree that provided ample shading, but also cooling. And this is reflected in those air temperatures being much lower for large proportions of the day, even lower during the early afternoon when you have your lunch break. So I don't know if you can still see that. If I hover my mouse over this area, this is during the lunch break, the large tree, and the much cooler side still during the morning hours at the central schoolyard. As I said, we looked at air temperatures and measurements in the sun and also in the shade to figure out what the differences are that we can achieve by shading. And shading, usually in my field of science, where I look at heat mitigation in urban space, shading means lowering of surface temperature. But if you have a very hot surface, of course, the radiant heat coming off that surface can also accelerate and increase air temperature again. That's why we wanted to look at air temperatures in the sun and in the shade. Now, if you look at the different types of environments that we were in, the playground, the schoolyard, the walkways that were already shaded, where you had little pergolas. It's a very common thing across schools now where you have pergolas over those walkways. We also looked at the garden with bare soil and open space where we had dry grass. And here we list 3 different days. So a day where we have air temperatures below 30 degrees. Then we have air temperatures at around 35 degrees Celsius and air temperature above 40 degrees in panels C. It's very interesting that, of course, first of all, we're not having a huge reduction. We do have a reduction somewhere between 1 and 2 degrees that we can achieve by shading, but the effectiveness of shading when air temperatures increase is actually getting smaller and smaller. So you can see that temperatures in the left-hand ABC panels go up our 3 days with 30, 35 and above 40 degrees. But when you look at the right-hand side ABC panels, you can see that the bars are basically becoming shorter and shorter, migrating towards 0. Particularly at the very hot day in panel C, you see that we don't even realize only temperature reductions. There are also temperature increases in certain areas. And I must say that this data is interesting because, as you recall, 2019-20 was our black summer. We had a lot of smoke cover, haze, in the Sydney Basin from the fires in the Blue Mountains. And particularly during those very hot days, we had sometimes half-shaded conditions where we were above 40 degrees, but we didn't have full solar radiation. And this is something that we regularly see in the Sydney Basin, where we can have heat waves coming through without a clear blue sky. It actually happens more often than not. This is something where we experience these hot spells coming through with superheated air from the central Australian landscapes, where we don't even need solar radiation to add any energy, because the air that is blown into our region here in Greater Sydney is already very, very hot. And that's where we, in those very hot days, often experience that at least shading doesn't make any difference anymore on air temperature. A few impressions about where it is hot and
where it is cool. These are on the left-hand side, just normal views, and the right-hand side of these images shows you the infrared impression of the same view. Hot surfaces generally are found in unshaded places, places that have artificial surface cover, and also a low reflectivity, meaning they are absorbing a lot of energy and not reflecting it. Examples shown here include AstroTurf in A and B at the top, an area, and I see this a lot in schools these days, an area covered that would otherwise be soil, covered in AstroTurf for, I guess, again, maintenance and convenience. The next two pictures in the center show you the central schoolyard. As we saw before, there is no shade. Surface temperatures go up to about 60 degrees. Same with the AstroTurf in these images. And when we look at the bottom, we can see the shading effect on soil underneath or ground underneath the trees, where surface temperature is about air temperature, somewhere between 32 and 35 degrees on that day. And in the foreground, we see bare soil heating up again to about 60 degrees. So a huge difference, basically cutting ground or surface temperature by half if we have tree shade included. Areas that are cool, those are the areas that we find in shade. Often, yes, artificially provided shade, and also naturally shaded areas. So again, infrared images here show the big cola of that school. It's shading bitumen, and you can see the temperature difference between shaded and non-shaded bitumen just in the foreground, where you see the red color in panel B, a temperature of around 50 degrees, whereas when shaded, you see a temperature reduction of about 20 degrees within about a meter, where these temperatures will go down very sharply, depending on the footprint of that shade. We look at the walkways, the shaded walkways, as you can see here. The ground surface temperature of the light colored concrete is very low compared to the garden, for example, but also very interesting here to see how heat is radiated from the above tin roof onto your structures underneath the tin roof. In this instance here, when you look at panel D, the handrails, which are much hotter in surface temperature compared to the ground in blue, where you have handrails showing up in yellow. So that is because the radiant heat from the tin roof that is not insulated is basically shading, but providing radiant heat onto or into the area underneath those very hot panels, as you can see, 60 degrees and plus. At the bottom, a little tree grove towards the east of that school, providing very low temperatures on the surface, ground surface, but also when you look at the classrooms, there are windows facing towards the trees, and all of these are at very low temperatures just because they are either east facing, that's already a cooler side of the school, but also because you have tree shade around them, and of course the transpirative cooling that is in addition to the shading of the tree canopies.
Sebastian,
yes, please.
could I just interrupt there? Do you think we could move on to the recommendations, just so we've got enough time to explore those?
Yeah, sure.
If that's okay.
Am I talking too long?
Not at all. It's all very interesting, but I don't want us to miss out on the recommendations bit.
No problem. So recommendations. I tried to make it very graphic. So there are green thumbs or red thumbs. Of course, green thumb is good, red thumb is bad. I explain here, you can see a lot of shade being provided either by trees or by artificial structure, a man-made structure. The whole schoolyard is under shade, which is fantastic. In the bad example, we don't have any shade introduced into the schoolyard, and we have a large area of AstroTurf, one of the hottest materials that I find in playgrounds, either in schools or in public parks. Not very good. This is the Early Learning Center at the Kingswood campus of my own university in Penrith. It has good and bad aspects. As you can see, I put in both thumbs because we do have as a good aspect those trees on the western side giving us very nice shade during the afternoon. However, you can see that the whole fence line facing north, so we're looking towards the south, the whole northern fence line has zero shade. That means for a long time during the day, there will be no shade provided in the outdoor playing area. Also very bad about this one, and it was redesigned by now because of the work that we've done with them. On the left-hand side, close to the red thumb, is a large area covered with astroturf and has a dark shade sail relatively low above it. So I can, even I'm not a very tall person, but I can touch this shade sail, and I measured air temperatures of above 45 degrees under that shade sail. There's no airflow, and then you have the very hot radiant heat coming off the astroturf, actually heating up the air underneath that sail. So we needed to change that. There are some good aspects, some bad aspects. I just wanted to show you an example of where you have this relatively non-homogeneous environment with different installations that provide shade and also different types of surface materials. When we look at this early learning center, of course, there are lots of bad things happening here. First thing again is no shade provided in this area, large surface cover of artificial materials, astroturf again, and we see also dark blue soft fall rubber in the foreground. And then of course the building itself has dark cladding, which means there's a lot of radiant heat coming off just the building structure, re-radiating into the play space. This is another early learning center on our campus at the Hawkesbury that also was included in a research study. And this turned out to be one of the coolest places that we can have even during heat waves. And that is of course because we have no artificial surfaces. All the surface that is not vegetation covered is underneath the tree canopy and is provided, which is providing shade. And you also have the tree itself that is helping to keep air temperature down due to the transpirative cooling that comes off that canopy. These are recommendations that we actually included in the report. I'm not going to read through all of them. If you download the report, they are like a cheat sheet at the very beginning of the report itself. There are strategies that can reduce outdoor heat. There is improving heat management with, for example, having those maps that I showed you, where you can identify high temperatures and low temperature areas in your schools. Also, when you look at new built environment, what can be done to really make those school environments heat smart, including tree plantings, but also extending into cool roof technology, use of light colors, avoid astroturf and other artificial dark surfaces, particularly rubber surfaces in dark colors. So there's a whole list of recommendations that we explain in more detail towards the end of the report. With that, I'll leave it to you. I talked about these 3 reports and am aware that we will have another little presentation or a bigger presentation about the benchmarking tree canopy study that we did with Greening Australia, and how the program is actually starting to roll out into schools in Greater Sydney. With that, I leave it.
Yep.
And thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Could you mentioned to me the other day about some low cost, low budget solutions that schools could look at. Could you touch on those?
So, of course, a low budget option is always to start implementing green infrastructure in any form. That can be as cheap as being, a planter box that you put out there. Other options that are relatively cheap is to get rid of artificial materials and replace them with natural materials. Even wood chips are better, although they can get quite hot, but they're still better in terms of heat conductance than, for example, astroturf. If there are any other options that I mentioned to you before and I can't recall right now. I think that would be it. Providing shade in any form is the best thing that you can do. And shade sails, I know, can be very expensive. Also, there's a problem when it comes to insurance to cover those shade sails. There are issues with the insurers that are not willing to take that kind of risk on because there were accidents related with shade sails or to shade sails. So that sometimes is not really an option.
Does anybody have any other questions for Sebastian? If you do, just go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
I also see there were a few questions coming through in the chat.
They're mainly from me, Sebastian. Hi,
Hey,
Suze. How are you?
Good, good, good.
I know that that you can get like misting systems from Bunnings that don't appear to be too expensive. Did you look at whether misting systems for schools might be effective in terms of cooling?
I did not in a school context. The technology is available. The problem that we see at a larger scale implementation of this technology is maintenance and health risks. There seemed to be a problem with fungal growth in nozzles. Also, this is a system that in most of the times is not really an industrial scale kind of application with the times of use that you want to get out of it. So it's more like a ad hoc fix. And that, of course, is not good enough when you really rely on it and then it doesn't function. So I haven't tested it in schools, but the current notion around misting is that there's still a few teething problems before we can implement that at scale.
Cool. And I had another question. You talked about, you know, don't put in those really hot surfaces if you can avoid it. I'm just wondering if there's a classification system that sort of tells you what's a hot system and what isn't. Is it R values, or is there a way of actually determining that?
A hot system?
So for materials that are used like in the public domain, do they get ranked by a particular categorization?
Not when it comes to surface temperature, not to my knowledge. These thermal aspects are not included. And when you look at the school build guidelines, those design guidelines, DGs, surface temperature is still not part of that. And that's a big problem because it's not just the surface type, but it's also its color. And maybe this is another cheap one that I can add to how to get surface temperatures down is by simply painting your surfaces with lighter colors. So if you have bitumen, there are applications from cool street, cool playground, and also cool roof technologies that can be applied to, let's say, your central schoolyard, like in the school that we showed here in Western Sydney, that will reflect heat instead of allowing heat to be absorbed by your surface. But Suze, I don't know that any of those are actually rated when it comes to heat. The same applies to softfall that comes in different colors, and I can already show that different colors make very different surface temperatures, even in the same material. But when you talk to either the producers or to the installers of this type of wet poor surface, nobody will talk to you about color and the relationship to temperature.
Sounds like we need a system, a rating system that we can specify. That would help.
We are working on a playground rating system where we incorporate part of this idea that you just mentioned, looking at surface types and their color and giving basically a star ranking to those. And then through a little formula, you come up with a rating star of 3 or 5 or 6 stars, telling you something about how climate smart the playground actually is. The same, of course, could be applied to schoolyards. It's no different.
Cool. I think Glenn's got some comments now. Pass over to him.
Yeah, I think Nicola might cover Glenn's comments in her presentation just about the liability of trees and school sites. So
we did touch a little bit on that in the report as well, to look at selecting appropriate trees that we thought were appropriate for schoolyards, and taking things into account, or looking at things like climbability, allergens, dropping green limbs, and so on, to then come up with a selection procedure that will help to select trees that are suitable for schools. Because of course the big problem is that one of dropping branches, which you absolutely do not want in your school.
Yeah.
But there are many other options of tree species that do not drop green limbs. So
Yeah.
it's just a matter of strategically selecting the right ones.
Okay. Thank you, Sebastian. I think that's really, really useful information. I think we might move on to Nicola now. Nicola Masters is from Greening Australia. She coordinates the Cooling the Schools program, which Sebastian has also worked with her on, I think. So Nicola's program works with schools to plant shade trees and also help reduce the temperature at schools. Nicola, are you able to share your screen?
Yes, I would like to. First of all, thank you. Thank you, Sebastian, for, as ever, your thoughtful research. And thank you for inviting me, Vicky, to present today. Let me see if I can share my screen. This should be easy, right? Here we go. Can you see that? Can you see?
Yep. All good.
Great. Awesome. So look, I've stolen these slides from another presentation, so please ask me questions as we go or at the end. First of all, Greening Australia, I'm hoping that most of you will have heard of us. We are okay, now I can't change my slides. There we go. So we have been active in the Australian landscape for over 38 years. However, we are only recently moving into the city environment. We've started off life doing a lot of this Great Southern Landscapes work out rehabilitating farmlands, working at the Great Barrier Reef. There's a big program in Tasmania. We have a lot of Indigenous programs. And then more recently, we've been moving into the cities environment, where obviously there's a whole different set of interesting things to think about. We have a program that started off literally at the beginning of this year called Cooling the Schools. And this was actually on the back of Sebastian's research. He mentioned the study benchmarking, which I actually thought he was going to present on today, but this was a piece of work that involved a lot of the concepts that he talked to, but it also involved heat mapping across the Greater Sydney area and looking at the socioeconomic impacts combined with the surface temperatures and other aspects to actually rank schools according to their heat vulnerability. So we have a list of our very own hottest 100 schools, which I think is a great title because it's like the Triple J hottest 100, right? So it's the schools that are most vulnerable to heat and, consequently, probably because they have the least amount of shade. So this has been funded by DPI. We have a partnership. Oh, it's one of these that does this, right? And we have a three-way conversation going very actively now between State School Infrastructure New South Wales, a segment of the Department of Education, DPI as our funding body, and Greening Australia. Now, DPI's main driver is part of the Premier's 5 million trees and increasing canopy cover across Sydney. Really, the driver is around heat and reducing heat in playgrounds. So this is a picture of a student using the heat guns that they use when you go into the Apple store or other things like that to take your temperature, and we've adapted them for an activity that the children can do to look at the effects of different surfaces on temperature. They actually really enjoy that. It's a great hands-on activity. We have the main goal of reducing urban heat, but on the side, of course, we like a bit of increasing of biodiversity and creating cooler outdoor spaces and increasing knowledge. That is one of the big drivers. This is an engagement program. First and foremost, we want the children to understand what they're doing. We want them to realize the benefits of planting trees and appreciate the benefits that they're getting from it. So Sebastian's work. I think that might have been stolen from your report, actually, Sebastian, identifying the most heat vulnerable schools. We then have gone to schools and we're working with them to create a planting design specific for their school environment. We have pre and post planting day lesson plans. So the idea is that the teachers within the classroom environment can deliver 2 lessons around the urban heat island effect and the benefits in the more general terms of ecosystem services that trees can provide. It's aimed at stage 3 and at stage 4, and then we have an incursion day where we come and we do planting, and then there has a post-planting activity for them to do as well as a reflection exercise. So I think that's pretty much covered there. As part of the program, we're also doing 12 community planting days as well, which we are yet to start up on, but I think we have got one penciled in for Willara in September, which is very exciting. And we're hoping that the schools that we engage will be active in encouraging the community out into those community planting days. 2-year outcomes, 240 schools, so that's 60 schools a semester. We currently have 84 applications. We actually have more, but not all of them are eligible. We are working very carefully with School Infrastructure New South Wales, and they are looking at every application that comes in, and some of them are not suitable at this stage because of bushfire risk. Sometimes it's about asbestos, sometimes it's about future build plans. Not all of them have been rejected. Some of them have just been pushed into the next year for potential rescreening and having to have a little bit more of a closer look. But what that means is that when we get to the school, we can be pretty confident that we have the buy-in from all the necessary people. The ASO comes along, and therefore we hopefully are planting trees for the long term. Overall, we're looking at 84,000 plants as part of the program in 2 years. We can offer on average 200 plants per school, which comes out to 150 trees and 50 ground species. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute in response to Glenn's questions. 18,000 people and 12 community planting events, as well as that is increases in knowledge, attitudes and intention to take conservation attitudes, which we're hoping to measure as part of the program. And that is our application page. So it's very easy to find us. We are just literally, if you Google Greening Australia and Cooling the Schools, you will find this portal. An application form takes about 5 minutes. It's a very simple process. The application then has to go off to School Infrastructure New South Wales to have a look at, and then hopefully comes back to us and we can get on with planning and scheduling dates. So just to go back a little bit to the species list that we were talking about, there has been a lot of risk aversion from schools, particularly in response to that nasty accident that terrible thing that we were talking about earlier. As part of that, we are, as a policy, not planting the eucalypts unless there's a special situation. So we're not going to be planting the really big trees. The eucalypts, angophoras and corymbias can drop their branches, and also their root systems can be problematic. So we've taken them off our screens list. We have things on our list like lily pillies, blueberry ash, bottle brushes, cheese trees, and Backhausia, what's that, myrtles, things like that. And we're also not adverse to planting the sort of exotic, benign type deciduous trees if it's in the right place and for the right reasons. So we have a screened list. Most of them are on the smaller side. DPI are very generous in what their definition of a tree is. We can sort of define it as anything that is 3 meters or above and woody, which, you know, could also be called a shrub. So we're trying to plant a mixture of species that are appropriate to the place and time, and that's co-designed with the school, with the principal and the ASO who we meet out on site. Yeah, does that answer your questions?
Nicola, do the schools need a lot of space to be able to be involved in this programme?
It definitely helps to have some, but you'd be amazed where you can squash a few shrubs in. We have an average of 200 plants per school, but we DPI have absolutely okayed that we can squeeze that around. So we have some schools out in the west. I went to school the other day that honestly I could fit 1,000 trees and you still wouldn't touch the sides. Some grounds are huge, so we can redeploy some schools. So certainly some of the schools in the east that maybe don't have as much, or in the center of the city, we could go down to as low as 50 plants. I don't think we could go much lower than that. But yeah, you don't need to have a huge amount of space. You need to have some.
Bit of space. And you mentioned to me that you would look at working with early education centres as well, again, if they had space, which is
absolutely. We're not. We're also open to the private sector as well. So anywhere that we can plant trees, that people want trees, we can definitely accommodate.
Great. Sounds good. Does anybody have any questions for Nicola before we wrap up?
Oh, Glenn's asked, is the program free? Absolutely. It is free. It's totally funded by DPI. However, there is no maintenance covered in that. So it will need to be something that the school is willing to incorporate into its existing grounds management. We can give some advice around that. We certainly recommend that site preparation is really advantageous. So if we're planting into grass at the back of an oval, if we can put a bit of herbicide down first, that is going to make a big difference to the survival of the plants. Likewise, some mulch goes a long way to helping for those first couple of years. But otherwise free, yeah.
Fantastic. Anybody got any other questions? No? Great. Thank you very much, Nicola.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.